he started hearing the phrase CTE with professional football.
Probably most notably when linebacker Junior Seau committed suicide in 2012. Following his death, the National Institutes of Health released findings of a study that showed Seau suffered abnormalities associated with the progressive degenerative brain disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE.
A disease that's been linked to memory loss, mood swings, and headaches.
But it wasn't just Seau. As a matter of fact, cases of CTE in professional football have gone back years.
Legendary center Mike Webster retired from football after 17 seasons. The documentary League of Denial shows during retirement, Webster began to show signs of depression, mood swings, and dementia. His wife eventually left him.
After Webster's death in 2002, an autopsy showed he suffered from CTE. Webster was the first professional football player diagnosed.
Now, other living players have come forward announcing they've also been diagnosed with CTE. Among them, Pro Football Hall of Famer Tony Dorsett, who has compared getting hit in the NFL to a freight train hitting a Volkswagen.
Former New York All-Pro Leonard Marshall says he's also been diagnosed with CTE. He says it's caused him a tremendous amount of damage, including contributing to the end of his marriage as well.
But the disease isn't just limited to professional football. An autopsy conducted after 28-year-old professional hockey player Derek Boogaard's death showed he had advanced stages of CTE. Boogaard died of a drug overdose.
The late Ryan Friel is considered the first professional baseball player to be diagnosed with CTE. According to his family, the former Oriole struggled with depression, drug and alcohol abuse, and then got divorced.
Friel took his own life last December. He was only 36 years old.
As a matter of fact, it's serious head injuries like those that Friel and other athletes were used to that prompted Major League Baseball to ban home plate collisions by next year. Now, as you just heard, in some of those cases, a diagnosis of CTE wasn't given until after the athlete's death. Could the condition have worsened through the years after so many head collisions? And at what age does this condition even start developing?
Parents, you may be surprised to hear serious head injuries like these are not limited to professional athletes. In fact, they're not limited to athletes at all. Joining us today to tell us more is Dr. Richard Bird, a neurologist with Peninsula Regional Medical Center. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Dr.
My pleasure.
Bird. First of all, let's start off with what is CTE?
Well, by definition, it's a progressive degenerative brain disorder caused by trauma to the brain, either one large or multiple sequential traumas. And it's manifested by gradual dementia, personality change, temperament changes with rage, aggression, major depression, very poor judgment, very poor impulse control, often subsequent drug abuse, and eventual death by either the dementia, suicide, or other drug affections, things like this. It's a progressive disorder.
Where does all this start?
With head injuries. It can start whenever anybody has a head injury that's anything of significance. It could be as a child with a bad falls. It could be as a teenager with an automobile accident, playing football, fights. A lot of things can do it. It depends on the degree of injury and how many you've had, and essentially who you are, because not everybody gets this.
Right, and it could happen, or you could get the diagnosis years after that,
yes.
Even decades after that head injury?
Yes. It used to be known as dementia pugilistica, or punch drunk syndrome. It was pretty much well known that this is an event of people who have careers as boxers, where they were hit and knocked out several times or multiple concussions, which is the goal of boxing, of course.
Right.
And within 20, 30 years, most of these people were demented and institutionalized. And it was thought at that time it was only major boxers or people with major head injuries, say an automobile accident when you were 16, when you drove into a tree and knocked yourself out and were hospitalized for a week type of thing,
right.
That down the road later you might get a dementia. But now we're starting to see this is much more common and a kind of under the radar kind of a picture than we ever thought.
You know, I was going to ask, we hear a lot about the tendencies, the possibilities of teenagers getting concussions while playing football. Does that make them at risk for CTE?
It does for some. The question is how many and who, because not everybody gets this. Many people play professional football just as much as the people we've mentioned and never get this disorder, but why some get it and others don't. So anybody is potentially at risk, but we don't know that they necessarily are going to get the problem down the road.
Well, we talk about contact sports, but what about sports that have little or no, I guess, personal contact? We're hearing it in those cases.
Pro tennis and golf are very good at this. We don't see this in probably tennis players and golf, and probably rare in baseball. Ryan Friel, I think, is probably an exception. One would wonder about somebody like Brian Roberts of the Orioles, who's also suffered several concussions, because concussions aren't that common in baseball unless you have a collision at home plate or on the bases, or you hit a wall trying to make a catch. So those sports are probably not as much, say, as football, hockey, boxing, of course, and even basketball, when you see a lot of these players hitting the floor, coming off a rebound and hitting their heads on the floor.
Okay, so we're talking sports here. Is this just limited to sports?
Oh, no. Head injuries of any kind can do this. Young men who get involved in a lot of bar fights, for example, car accidents, bad falls type of thing. Sometimes it's the number of injuries, the severity of the injuries, and again, who this person is who might be susceptible, because there has to be a susceptibility feature to this too, because the vast majority of people don't get this disorder, just some.
Military veterans?
Yes, people in the combat who've had explosions, who've been the AEDs, the explosions in the vehicles that were badly hurt, or concussion grenades or things like this, who may have been hurt or rendered unconscious. And several of the veterans undergo several of these and are at risk for this later in life.
And you've seen this pretty early on in some patients.
I've seen it in a few. We haven't seen many of them, but I've seen it in a few. I've seen it late in life in young men who've had to get car accidents, and now they're in their 50s and 60s and dementing and having trouble, and we felt it was due to the head injury. I have currently a patient who's a teacher and a soccer coach who had multiple concussions in his career in soccer, and he's beginning to notice his moods are different. He's getting very angry over things that never used to bother him. And his short-term memory's a little bit off, just enough that it's really starting to bother him a bit, and he's worried. And I think he has reasons to be worried.
Let's talk about signs and symptoms of CTE. What are they?
Well, dementia, eventually, the loss of cognitive abilities, confusion, impaired judgment, like I say, and paranoia, anger, suspiciousness, impulse control disorder, drinking, gambling, this kind of thing, aggression, major depression is very common, and a gradual progressive dementia. You may or may not get any motor manifestations, Parkinson's, slowness, things like that. It's mainly in the mental cognitive fields that we see this.
It seems like all of a sudden we're hearing a bunch about CTE. Why have we not heard about this before now?
Well, it's never really appreciated except in boxers. And for most of my training, a concussion was felt to be a temporary event that left no permanent sequelae whatsoever. You just wrote it out, you toughed it up, you played through it, or you sat out a little bit, and not to worry, it was a temporary event. But now we're rethinking all of that. Because since Mike Webster and the subsequent football players, and as many Americans are football fans and recognize a lot of these names, and now we have the legal action by the Players Association against the NFL, all of a sudden there's a lot of attention being paid to this as to how far we have to go to protect the players. You see now players coming out of games that ordinarily would have gone back in after a couple of plays that aren't going to play again for a couple of weeks.
So if you've got somebody that is showing these signs and symptoms, can you just diagnose it?
You can, hopefully clinically, but unfortunately none of the studies show anything. You don't see it on MRI scans, CAT scans, EEGs, lab work, things like that.
How's it diagnosed then?
Post-mortem. Only on autopsy. So far we don't have a living diagnostic study except clinical suspicion that this is what's going on. But testing doesn't help you with imaging. We don't see it.
How about that?
What about concussions, which you say can be the start of CTE? Is there a blood test? We've heard taught that there could be a blood test on the horizon.
They've been working on it. They've got several markers they've been trying to do. One current one in investigation, one called microRNA, thinking like, and many people, for example, with a heart attack, you have a rise in blood enzymes from the heart, from the muscle tissue, that you can take a blood test and actually diagnose it. And hopefully the same will be true with concussions or head injuries, giving you confirming that there is a degree of possibility and how severe it is. Assumingly, the higher the blood test, the more severe the head injury, may give you some guideline markers of how long you keep this person out, what's the likelihood this person's going to get in trouble, should this person stop doing all sorts of sports now, type of thing.
I'm glad you said that, because if you're looking at somebody thinking, there's a good chance of CTE here, what do we do with them? What do they do to try to get past this?
once you've had significant head injuries, the question is, should you continue in the endeavor that got you the head injuries?
Okay.
You know, and I suspect several professional athletes are going to start retiring out of the game a lot earlier than they did because of medical advice of concussions. For example, football players most commonly, or hockey players.
So with the concussion, what's the best thing for us to do to try to recover from it?
Make sure that with a concussion, for example, if it's high school sports, that the person is removed from athletic competition totally until they've made a recovery and be covered. Most of the time we recognize or recommend that people have complete rest following a concussion. And particularly with the kids, this is complete rest of the brain. You know, no real
school,
physical
no homework,
activity,
nothing.
no physical activity, no driving, skateboarding, biking, no schoolwork for a while, no video games, which is going to be destructive to many young people.
So we've
no
got to
television, no scary movies, no watching
Just
sports,
rest the brain.
no parties. You sleep and you rest and let the brain recover faster
Just
to allow
gotta-
it to hopefully heal.
Just
And
gotta get
the
people
vast
to
majority of
recognize
people are
that.
going to heal fine without any problems down the road.
Doctor, thank you so much for some very important
Thank
information
you.
this afternoon.
And if you want to read more from PRMC about CTE and concussions, go to delmarvalife.com and click on the show tab.
Well, dangerous head injuries aren't the only thing many athletes face. Professional athletes also have a lot of training they go through. Up next on Delmarva Life, we speak with this guy, speed skater Patrick Meek, who's getting ready to compete at the Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia. Patrick tells us how he's preparing and how he was able to turn his dream of competing for gold into reality.
And later, how about some comfort food while we're watching the Winter Games? We head into the kitchen with Adam's Ribs. We're making 2 variations of a comfort classic, mac and cheese. Delmarva Life, we'll be right back.